The moment the kennel door closed between them, the smaller puppy froze. Ethan Walker watched as the little German shepherd pressed himself against the bars, searching for the only thing that had kept him alive during the freezing Montana storm. Across the narrow space, his older brother Bear slowly lifted his paw through the gap until it touched Finn's trembling paw. Only then did the smaller puppy finally relax. Ethan had seen that look before. A former Navy SEAL knew the difference between fear and weakness. He had watched soldiers hide pain behind silence, anger, and determination. But these two puppies were not afraid of the shelter, the lights, or the strangers around them. They were afraid of losing each other. They survived because they had each other, Ethan said quietly. Mark Reynolds, the shelter manager, looked down at the two kennel records and shook his head. They need separate files, separate adoption chances. Keeping bonded animals together only makes them harder to place. Sarah Collins looked at Ethan and saw the change in his expression. She knew that calm face meant something inside him was fighting. Bear pressed closer to the bars, refusing to move away from his brother. Ethan lowered his voice. You think they are depending on each other. I think they are the reason they survived. Mark's eyes hardened. You cannot save every lost thing, Ethan. The room fell silent. None of them knew those two abandoned puppies had arrived carrying a secret connected to a fallen canine soldier, a forgotten promise, and the part of Ethan's past he had spent years trying to bury. Before we begin, tell us what city you are watching from today. We would love to know how far this story travels. The Montana mountains disappeared beneath a wall of white as heavy snow buried the forests, roads, and lonely cabins beneath a freezing silence. For most people, a storm like this meant staying inside, locking the doors, and waiting for the world outside to become safe again. But for Ethan Walker, storms had never been something he could simply ignore. He had spent years walking into places where others were trying to escape from, first as a Navy SEAL, and later as a man who quietly helped those who had no one else to turn to. At 39 years old, Ethan lived alone in a small wooden cabin hidden deep in the Montana wilderness. The cabin sat at the edge of a pine forest, surrounded by snow-covered mountains and miles of untouched land. The outside walls were weathered from years of harsh winters, but the inside was carefully maintained, almost painfully organized. Every tool had its place, every piece of equipment was cleaned after use, and every morning began the same way, with a cup of black coffee beside the window overlooking the frozen valley. To strangers, Ethan looked exactly like what they expected from a former Navy SEAL. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the quiet strength of someone who had spent years training his body and mind for impossible situations. His dark brown hair was kept short, his sharp jaw carried a trimmed beard, and his blue eyes had the focused calm of a man who noticed everything around him. But those who knew him understood there was another side hidden beneath that disciplined appearance. Ethan was not the cold, emotionless soldier many people imagined. After leaving the military, he struggled with the memories of missions that never truly ended in his mind. He had lost friends, watched brave people make impossible sacrifices, and carried the heavy feeling that perhaps he could have done more. The battlefield was gone, but some battles followed him home. That was why he spent so much of his time helping animals. The people in the nearby town of Pine Ridge knew Ethan as the man they called when a frightened dog refused to let anyone near, when an injured animal was trapped somewhere dangerous, or when a creature had lost its trust in humans. He never rushed them. He never forced them. Ethan understood that fear was not something you defeated with strength. It was something you overcame with patience. That morning, while snow tapped against his kitchen window, Ethan was repairing an old wooden chair near the fireplace when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw the name of Sarah Collins. Sarah was a volunteer coordinator at Pine Valley Animal Rescue, a small shelter located about 40 minutes from Ethan's cabin. She was a woman in her early 30s with a gentle but determined personality. Sarah had shoulder-length chestnut hair, warm brown eyes, and a slim build that made her look fragile at first glance. But everyone who worked with her knew she possessed incredible strength. She had spent years rescuing abandoned animals, often staying late at the shelter and carrying injured dogs twice her size. Her compassion came from personal experience, because she had once lost her own childhood dog during a winter storm and never forgot the helpless feeling of not being able to save it. When Sarah called Ethan, it usually meant something had gone wrong. "Ethan, I need your help," she said as soon as he answered. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the concern underneath it. Ethan placed the chair repair tools down. "What happened?" "There are 2 puppies near an old service road outside town. A truck driver spotted them this morning. They were hiding beside a broken wooden crate, and with this weather, I don't think they've been there for just a few hours." Ethan looked toward the window. Snow was falling harder now, covering the driveway he had cleared earlier that morning. "Are they injured?" "We don't know," Sarah replied. "The driver tried to approach them, but they wouldn't move. They only stayed close together." Ethan became silent for a moment. That one sentence caught his attention. They only stayed close together. He had heard those words before. Not about dogs, but about soldiers. People who survived impossible situations often held on to the one thing that made them feel safe. "I'll go," Ethan said. Sarah released a quiet breath of relief. "I knew you would." Within minutes, Ethan prepared his truck. He packed a medical kit, blankets, food, and a large animal carrier. Before leaving, he looked around his quiet cabin for a moment. Years ago, he would have considered helping 2 abandoned puppies a small thing compared to his old missions. But life had taught him something different. Sometimes the smallest lives carried the biggest reasons to keep moving forward. The drive toward the old service road was difficult. Snow covered the mountain path, and the wind pushed against his truck as if trying to force him back. Ethan drove slowly, his trained instincts constantly watching the environment. He noticed every change in the road, every movement in the trees, every sound beneath the storm. When he finally arrived, he saw the broken crate near the edge of the road. The sight immediately bothered him. Someone had left 2 living creatures here during a storm that could kill them. Ethan stepped out of the truck and walked carefully through the snow. His boots sank with every step, but he moved slowly, knowing sudden movements could frighten already terrified animals. Then he heard it, a small whimper beneath the wind. He lowered himself near the crate and looked inside. 2 German Shepherd puppies were curled together. The first one was slightly larger, probably around 10 weeks old. He had thick black and tan fur, a darker muzzle, and intelligent amber eyes that watched Ethan carefully. Even at such a young age, there was something protective about him. His body was positioned between Ethan and the smaller puppy behind him. The second puppy was smaller and thinner, with softer fur and lighter markings around his face. His ears were still slightly floppy, and his body trembled from the cold. But despite his fear, he never moved away from his brother. Ethan immediately noticed something unusual. The larger puppy was freezing, but he had chosen the position closest to the wind. He was protecting the smaller one. Ethan slowly removed his gloves and placed his hand near the ground. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. The larger puppy stared at him. For a moment, Ethan saw the same hesitation he had seen in wounded soldiers after battle. The animal was not aggressive. He was simply trying to determine whether the world was still dangerous. Ethan placed a blanket on the snow. He did not reach for them. He waited. Minutes passed. The storm continued around them, but Ethan remained still. Eventually, the larger puppy moved one paw forward. He looked back at his brother. The smaller puppy hesitated, then touched his nose against him. Only after that did the larger puppy move closer. Ethan watched silently. They were not following food. They were not simply looking for warmth. They were moving together, one step at a time, one depending on the other. After nearly half an hour, both puppies crawled into the blanket-lined carrier. The larger puppy entered first, then turned around and waited until his brother followed. Ethan closed the door gently. As he carried them back to his truck, he looked down at the two small bodies pressed together inside. He had rescued many animals before, but something about these two felt different. They were not just siblings. They were survivors. And somehow, Ethan knew their story was only beginning. When he started the truck and drove toward Pine Valley Animal Rescue, he had no idea that within the next few hours, someone would make a decision that would threaten the only thing keeping these two puppies alive. The decision to separate them. Pine Valley Animal Rescue stood beneath the gray winter sky, surrounded by tall pine trees covered in fresh snow, and a narrow road that disappeared into the mountains. The small brick building was warm compared to the freezing world outside, but inside its walls were hundreds of stories of fear, survival, and second chances. Every kennel held an animal waiting for someone to see beyond its scars, and every person working there carried the weight of trying to save more lives than they had space for. When Ethan Walker stepped through the front door, carrying the two German Shepherd puppies, he already knew this place understood suffering. What he did not know was that this shelter would soon force him to face a decision that felt painfully familiar. Sarah Collins immediately noticed the carrier in Ethan's hands and hurried from behind the front desk. Her chestnut hair was tied back loosely, and several strands had fallen around her tired face after a long morning of paperwork and emergency calls. She was a slim woman in her early 30s, with warm brown eyes and a gentle expression that made frightened animals feel safer around her. Although she looked delicate, Sarah had developed a quiet strength after years of working at Pine Valley Animal Rescue. She was the type of person who would skip meals, sleep less, and stay through the night if it meant one abandoned animal had a better chance of surviving. Her compassion came from a painful memory from childhood, when she lost her own dog during a winter storm and spent years wondering if she could have done something differently. That loss shaped the woman she became, someone who believed no creature should ever feel abandoned when there was still someone willing to fight for them. "You found them," Sarah said softly, as Ethan placed the carrier on the examination table. Ethan nodded and removed his gloves. "Near the northern ridge. Someone left them beside an old wooden crate during the storm." Sarah's expression changed as she looked inside. The larger puppy immediately lifted his head, placing himself slightly in front of the smaller one, even though there was no danger inside the shelter. The smaller puppy pressed against his brother's side, calmer now, but still unwilling to move away. Sarah watched them carefully before opening the carrier door. "They really have not separated at all, have they?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "Not once." A few minutes later, Dr. Claire Morgan entered the room carrying a medical bag. Claire was a woman in her early 40s with short blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and a calm presence that immediately changed the atmosphere around nervous animals. She had worked as a veterinarian for more than 15 years and had earned a reputation for treating rescue animals with both medical skill and emotional understanding. Unlike some professionals who only focused on injuries and symptoms, Claire believed behavior revealed what an animal had survived. She had learned over the years that a frightened animal could hide pain just as effectively as a wounded person. When she examined Bear and Finn, she moved slowly, speaking quietly so they would not feel threatened. "The bigger one is exhausted, but strong," Claire said, after checking Bear's paws and temperature. "He has some cold exposure, but nothing serious. The smaller one is underweight and dehydrated, but he should recover." She looked toward Ethan. "They were lucky you found them when you did." Ethan looked through the glass door of the carrier. Bear was lying beside Finn, his head resting against his brother's back. They were lucky they had each other. Claire followed his gaze. That might be the reason they survived. Before Ethan could answer, the office door opened behind them. A man stepped into the room holding a clipboard against his chest. Mark Reynolds was the manager of Pine Valley Animal Rescue, a man in his late 40s with neatly combed dark grey hair, sharp facial features, and a controlled expression that rarely revealed what he was thinking. He was not an unfriendly man, but years of managing a crowded shelter had changed the way he looked at problems. Mark believed emotions could make people hesitate when difficult decisions had to be made. After watching countless animals come and go through the shelter without knowing their future, he had trained himself to focus on numbers, schedules, and practical solutions. His serious personality was not born from cruelty. It came from years of trying to protect a shelter that never had enough resources. "These are the puppies from the storm?" Mark asked. Sarah nodded. 2 male German Shepherd mixes, around 10 weeks old. Mark looked through the paperwork, then at the 2 puppies inside the carrier. His eyes paused briefly when he noticed how close they were lying together. 2 puppies, he said. Ethan immediately understood the concern behind those words. "They are brothers." Mark nodded. "I assumed that. They need to stay together." The room became quiet. Mark placed the clipboard on the table. "Ethan, I understand why you feel attached. You found them. You brought them here. But we have to think about what gives them the best chance of adoption." Ethan looked at him. "And do you think separating them does that?" Mark sighed quietly. "Bonded animals are harder to place. Families often want 1 puppy. 2 means more food, more training, more responsibility. We have limited space and limited resources." Sarah looked uncomfortable. She understood Mark's concerns, but she also understood what Ethan was seeing. "They are not acting like ordinary littermates," she said carefully. Mark glanced at her. "Sarah, every bonded pair looks different in the beginning. Puppies adapt." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He had heard that word before. Adapt. People used it when they wanted someone or something to accept a painful situation because changing it seemed inconvenient. He had heard commanders say soldiers would adapt after losing friends. He had heard people say injured animals would adapt after losing homes. Sometimes adaptation was necessary, but sometimes people confused survival with healing. "They are not afraid of the shelter," Ethan said quietly. "They are afraid of losing each other." Mark looked at him. "You cannot build adoption decisions around feelings." Ethan stared at the puppies. "No," he replied, "but you can destroy trust by ignoring them." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mark made his decision. "Separate kennels, separate records. We will evaluate them individually." Sarah looked at him. "Mark." But he had already turned away. Ethan watched silently as Sarah prepared the kennels. He wanted to stop it, but he knew he had no authority here. This was not a battlefield where he could give an order. This was a shelter, and every person believed they were doing what was best. Bear was placed in the first kennel. Finn was placed in the one beside him. The moment the metal door closed, Ethan saw the change. Finn froze. The small puppy who had endured freezing temperatures and an unfamiliar human approach without panic suddenly became completely still. His ears lowered, and his eyes searched desperately for his brother. Bear turned around immediately, pressing his body against the bars between them. Then Bear lifted his paw. Finn moved closer. Their paws touched through the narrow opening. The effect was immediate. Finn stopped trembling. Bear lowered his head. The 2 puppies stayed there silently, connected by a space barely wide enough for their paws. Sarah covered her mouth slightly, unable to hide her emotion. "I have never seen anything like this." Ethan did not answer right away. Because he had. Not with dogs. With soldiers. With people who had survived terrible moments because one person beside them reminded them they were not alone. Mark stood several feet away, watching the puppies. For a brief second, his serious expression softened, as if the scene reminded him of something he had buried long ago. But the moment passed, and he looked back at the paperwork in his hand. "We cannot keep them dependent forever," Mark said. Ethan turned toward him. "You think they are weak because they need each other?" Mark said nothing. Ethan looked back at Bear and Finn. Maybe they survived because they had each other. The shelter became quiet again. After several minutes, Ethan stepped away from the kennels. He knew arguing further would not change Mark's decision today. He had spent years learning when to fight and when to wait. But walking away from those two puppies felt different. Sarah followed him toward the entrance. "Ethan," she said softly, "give me some time. I will talk to him." Ethan looked through the glass one last time. Bear and Finn were still touching paws. "Make sure they remember they are not alone," he said. Sarah nodded. Outside, snow began falling again. Ethan walked back to his truck, but the image stayed in his mind. Two small puppies behind separate doors, holding onto the only connection they had left. As he drove away from Pine Valley Animal Rescue, Ethan told himself he was leaving because Sarah needed time to handle the situation. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had walked away from battlefields. He had walked away from painful memories, but he was not sure he could walk away from two frightened puppies who were asking for only one thing: not to be separated. 3 days had passed since Ethan Walker left Pine Valley Animal Rescue, but the image of two small puppies, separated by metal doors, continued to follow him through every quiet moment in his cabin. The mountains outside his window were still covered in snow, and the world around him remained peaceful. But inside his mind, there was a constant battle between logic and instinct. He told himself that Sarah was there, that the shelter staff understood animals, and that Mark Reynolds had made the decision based on years of experience rather than cruelty. Yet every time Ethan remembered Finn's trembling body and Bear's paw reaching through the bars, he felt the same discomfort that had followed him after leaving soldiers behind on the battlefield. Some memories refused to disappear because they were not asking to be forgotten. They were asking to be answered. Ethan tried to return to his normal routine, but even simple tasks became difficult to focus on. He chopped firewood behind the cabin, repaired a damaged fence near the driveway, and cleaned equipment that had not needed cleaning, all because keeping his hands busy was easier than admitting he was worried. For years, he had trained himself to control emotions during dangerous situations, to separate feelings from decisions, and to keep moving, even when something inside him wanted to stop. But this situation felt different, because there was no enemy to defeat and no mission to complete. There were only two innocent animals that could not explain their fear with words, and Ethan understood their silence better than he wanted to admit. Late in the afternoon, his phone rang while he stood near the kitchen window, watching snow fall over the valley. Sarah Collins' name appeared on the screen, and Ethan answered before the second ring finished. "Tell me they are okay," he said immediately, because he already knew Sarah would not call unless something had changed. There was a pause before she responded, and that silence told him more than her words could have. Sarah explained that Bear and Finn were physically healthy, but their behavior had changed since the separation. Finn had stopped eating properly. Bear refused to settle unless he could see his brother, and both puppies became anxious whenever they were placed too far apart. Ethan closed his eyes as he listened. He had seen that kind of reaction before, not from animals, but from people who had experienced loss. During his years in the military, he had watched strong men break after losing the person who stood beside them through impossible moments. The world often misunderstood attachment as weakness, but Ethan knew better. Sometimes the connection between two people, or two animals, was not something that made them fragile. Sometimes it was the only thing keeping them standing. "I'm coming back," Ethan said quietly, before ending the call. When Ethan arrived at Pine Valley Animal Rescue, Sarah was waiting near the kennel area. She looked exhausted, with tired eyes beneath her chestnut hair and a concerned expression that showed how much the situation had affected her. She had spent the last several days trying to follow shelter procedures, while also watching two frightened puppies struggle emotionally. Sarah had always believed rules existed to protect animals, but now she found herself questioning whether a rule could still be right if it caused more harm than good. "He still believes he made the correct choice," she said softly, looking toward Mark Reynolds' office. Ethan followed her gaze and saw the shelter manager standing behind his desk, reviewing paperwork. Mark Reynolds looked exactly as he had before. Neatly combed dark grey hair, clean clothing, and a serious expression that revealed very little emotion. He was a man who had spent years carrying responsibility for hundreds of animals, and that responsibility had shaped him into someone who trusted systems more than instincts. Mark was not careless or cruel. He had simply learned that shelters survived by making difficult choices. Every empty kennel mattered, every adoption delay mattered, and every animal that stayed too long represented another animal that could not enter the shelter. But Ethan noticed something different when Mark looked toward Bear and Finn. For the briefest moment, there was hesitation in his eyes, as if even he could not completely ignore what he was seeing. "You came back," Mark said when Ethan entered the office area. "I needed to see them." Mark nodded slowly. "And I suppose you still believe they should stay together?" Ethan looked toward the kennel row where the two puppies rested. "I believe we should listen when animals show us something this clearly." Mark leaned against the desk and crossed his arms. "You think I don't care about them?" Ethan studied him carefully. "I think you care. I think you care enough that you are afraid of making the wrong decision." The words seemed to surprise Mark. For a moment, the shelter manager looked away toward the window where snow covered the parking lot. He had spent years convincing himself that emotions only made difficult choices harder, but Ethan's words touched something he had tried to ignore. Still, Mark shook his head. Caring does not change reality. Someone has to think about what happens next. Ethan did not argue. Instead, he walked toward the kennels where Bear and Finn were waiting. The larger puppy noticed him first and slowly stood up. Bear's amber eyes followed Ethan's movement, but before approaching, he looked toward Finn as if checking that his brother was following. Finn immediately moved beside him, and the two puppies walked together toward the front of the kennel. Ethan placed his hand against the bars, and both puppies leaned forward until their noses touched his fingers. Sarah watched quietly beside him. "They trust you." Ethan shook his head slightly. "They trust that I won't leave them." The sentence stayed in the air longer than either of them expected. Ethan realized he was not only talking about the puppies, he was talking about every person and every creature that had experienced loss, and wondered if someone would stay. He had spent years believing survival meant learning how to stand alone, but Bear and Finn were showing him another kind of strength. That night, after leaving the shelter, Ethan returned to his cabin, carrying the weight of the decision with him. The house was quiet as always, but something felt different. He walked through the hallway and stopped in front of the door he had avoided for 3 years. Behind that door were the belongings of Rook, his former canine partner and closest companion after the military. Rook had been more than a working dog. He had been the one constant presence through missions, injuries, and the difficult years after returning home. When Rook died, Ethan felt as if he had lost the last piece of his old life, and closing that door became his way of protecting himself from the pain. For years, Ethan walked past that room without opening it. He convinced himself that leaving the past untouched was easier than facing it. But standing there that night, he thought about Bear and Finn, separated by a simple barrier, still reaching for each other despite everything around them. Slowly, Ethan placed his hand on the doorknob and turned it. The room smelled exactly as he remembered: cedar, old blankets, and the faint scent of a life that had ended, but never truly left. Rook's collar hung beside the shelf, his old bowl remained beneath the window, and the empty bed still carried the shape of a place where someone had once rested. Ethan stepped inside for the first time in years. He touched the collar gently, feeling the cold metal tag beneath his fingers. For a long moment, he simply stood there, allowing memories he had avoided to return. He remembered Rook running beside him, protecting him, and trusting him without hesitation. Ethan finally understood that he had not avoided the room because he was strong. He had avoided it because he was afraid that opening the door meant reopening the pain. But maybe healing did not mean leaving the past behind. Maybe healing meant accepting that the past could remain a part of him without controlling him. The next morning, Ethan returned to Pine Valley Animal Rescue before Sarah expected him. She looked surprised when she saw him walk through the entrance. "You made a decision," she said, noticing the certainty in his expression. Ethan nodded and walked toward Mark's office. "I want to foster them." Mark looked up from the paperwork in front of him, clearly surprised. "Both of them?" he asked. Ethan did not hesitate. "Both." Mark studied him carefully, then looked toward the kennel area where Bear and Finn were waiting. "You understand this is temporary. Eventually they will need a permanent home." Ethan nodded. "Then we find a home that understands them." For several seconds, Mark said nothing. Finally, he opened the drawer beside his desk and removed the foster paperwork. Ethan signed every document without hesitation. When Sarah brought Bear and Finn out together, their entire bodies changed. Their tails moved, their expressions softened, and the anxiety they had carried disappeared almost instantly. They walked beside each other toward Ethan, no longer searching desperately, because they knew they were together. Ethan placed the carrier inside his truck and looked back at Pine Valley Animal Rescue one final time before leaving. He did not know where their story would lead. He did not know what challenges waited ahead, or whether he could truly give them the future they deserved. But as Bear rested beside Finn inside the carrier, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. These two puppies had spent their entire lives protecting each other. And now, for the first time, someone was going to protect them. The first morning Bear and Finn arrived at Ethan Walker's cabin, the mountains were covered in fresh snow, and the quiet wilderness felt different from the days before. For years, Ethan had been used to waking up in complete silence. His cabin had always been a place where he could escape the noise of the world and avoid the memories that followed him after leaving the military. Every morning had been predictable. Coffee by the window, checking the weather, repairing something around the property, and spending another day alone with thoughts he rarely shared with anyone. But now the silence was gone. The sound of small paws moving across the wooden floor filled the rooms, and for the first time in years, Ethan found himself adjusting his life around someone else. Bear and Finn were still young, but their personalities became clearer every day. Bear, the larger German Shepherd puppy with black and tan fur and intelligent amber eyes, was always watching his surroundings. Even while playing, he seemed aware of where Finn was and what he was doing. He was not aggressive or overly protective, but there was a natural responsibility in the way he behaved, almost as if he had decided long ago that his younger brother was his duty. Finn was smaller, with softer features, lighter markings, and a gentler personality. He was more cautious than Bear, but he was also curious, often following Ethan around the cabin and slowly learning that not every unfamiliar sound meant danger. Ethan spent the first few days simply observing them. He did not try to force training or change their behavior too quickly. His experience with military canines taught him that trust was built through consistency, not pressure. Every morning, he placed their food bowls a few feet apart, slowly teaching them that being separated for short moments did not mean they were being abandoned. At first, Finn would stop eating whenever Bear moved too far away, but after several attempts, he began to understand that his brother was always coming back. Ethan noticed every small improvement, and those small victories meant more to him than he expected. Sarah visited the cabin after several days to check on the puppies and bring additional supplies from Pine Valley Animal Rescue. She arrived wearing a dark winter coat over her usual shelter clothes, her chestnut hair tucked beneath a knitted hat to protect her from the cold wind. She carried a folder of paperwork, a bag of puppy food, and a tired smile that showed how much she had been working. When she stepped inside and saw Bear and Finn sleeping near Ethan's boots, she stopped for a moment, because the scene looked completely different from the anxious puppies she had seen behind shelter bars. "They look happier," Sarah said quietly. Ethan looked down at them. "They're learning." Sarah smiled slightly. "And you are too." Ethan looked at her, unsure how to respond. She knew him well enough to understand that taking care of the puppies was changing something inside him. Sarah had seen many people rescue animals, but she had also seen animals rescue people in ways they never expected. Ethan had spent years believing his purpose ended when he left the military, but Bear and Finn were slowly reminding him that protecting others did not require a battlefield. Over the next few weeks, the puppies continued to grow stronger. They learned the sounds of the cabin, the smell of the forest, and the routines of their new temporary home. Bear became brave enough to explore the yard, while Finn followed behind him, stopping occasionally to investigate patches of snow and fallen branches. They still stayed close, but the difference was that now they were not clinging together out of fear. They were choosing to stay together because they enjoyed each other's company. One evening, while Ethan was cleaning the old collar of his former canine partner Rook, Bear wandered into the room and noticed the object in his hand. The puppy approached slowly and sniffed the metal tag hanging from the collar. Finn followed behind him and looked at the tag with curiosity. Ethan watched them carefully, remembering how Rook had once carried a similar tag during years of service. At that moment, Ethan noticed something unusual. The collar Bear wore from the rescue shelter had a small metal piece attached beneath the damaged fabric. He had assumed it was just an old identification tag, but now he saw markings beneath the dirt and scratches. The snow and weather had damaged the surface, but several letters were still visible. Ethan picked it up carefully. The moment he read the name, his entire body became still. Daniel Hayes. For a few seconds, the cabin disappeared around him. Daniel had been more than a teammate. He had been one of the few people Ethan trusted completely during his military years. They had served together through dangerous missions, difficult recoveries, and moments when survival depended on trusting the person beside you. Daniel had also been a canine handler, someone who understood that military dogs were not equipment, they were partners. Years earlier, Daniel and his canine companion Luna had disappeared during a classified operation. The official report said the mission had failed, but many questions remained unanswered. Ethan had spent years wondering what truly happened, but eventually he accepted that some answers would never come. Until now. He looked down at Bear and Finn. The puppies had no idea what they had just revealed. The next morning, Ethan returned to Pine Valley Animal Rescue with the collar tag. Sarah immediately noticed something was wrong when she saw his expression. Ethan was usually calm, even under pressure, but now there was something different in his eyes. "What happened?" she asked. Ethan placed the metal tag on the table. Sarah leaned closer. This was on Bear's collar. She read the name. Her expression changed. "Daniel Hayes?" Ethan nodded slowly. Sarah knew Daniel's name because Ethan had mentioned him once before. She knew he was a fallen soldier, someone Ethan rarely spoke about because the memories were too painful. She also knew Ethan never reacted this way unless something mattered deeply. They began searching the shelter records, but the information was limited. The puppies had been found abandoned, and whoever left them behind had removed most identifying details. However, the discovery of the tag changed everything. Bear and Finn were not random abandoned puppies. They were connected to Ethan's past. Mark Reynolds learned about the discovery later that day. Unlike before, he did not dismiss Ethan's concerns. He looked at the tag carefully, and then at the two puppies resting nearby. For the first time since they arrived at the shelter, Mark stopped seeing them as two difficult cases. He saw a story that had been hidden. As Ethan prepared to leave with Bear and Finn, he looked once more at the old metal tag in his hand. The puppies had entered his life during a snowstorm, but now he realized the storm had brought something else with it. A forgotten connection, a lost piece of the past. and possibly the final clue to what happened to the person who had once trusted Ethan with everything. Ethan returned to his cabin that evening, with Bear and Finn beside him. But his mind was no longer focused only on protecting two puppies. Now, he needed to uncover the truth behind Daniel Hayes and the secret these two dogs had carried through the snow. The Montana mountains stood beneath a golden morning sky, and the first rays of sunlight touched the snow-covered trees surrounding Ethan Walker's cabin. Several months had passed since Bear and Finn entered Ethan's life, and the small cabin that once felt like a place of isolation had slowly transformed into something completely different. The wooden floors that had once carried only Ethan's footsteps were now filled with the sound of two growing German shepherds running from room to room. The quiet mornings that once reminded him of everything he had lost were now interrupted by curious noses pushing against his hands and two excited dogs waiting for the day to begin. Ethan never expected two abandoned puppies from a snowstorm to change the rhythm of his life. But somewhere along the way, they became more than animals he was protecting. They became the reason he started looking forward to tomorrow. Bear and Finn had grown stronger, but their bond remained the same. Bear was now larger, with a powerful frame, thick black and tan fur, and the same intelligent amber eyes that had watched Ethan carefully during their first meeting in the snow. He had become confident and protective, but he was no longer acting out of fear. Finn had grown as well, becoming healthier and more playful, with softer expressions and a curious personality that brought a different energy into the cabin. He was still the more cautious one, but he had learned that the world was not always dangerous. The biggest change was that neither puppy needed to cling desperately to the other anymore. They could explore separate parts of the yard, chase different sounds in the forest, and experience new things alone. Yet they always returned to each other because they wanted to, not because they were afraid. Ethan noticed that difference more than anyone. When he first found them, Bear and Finn were surviving. Now they were living. That realization stayed with Ethan because he understood the difference better than most people. For years, he had survived his own life after leaving the military. He woke up, completed tasks, and moved through each day because that was what he knew how to do. He had convinced himself that surviving was enough. But watching Bear and Finn grow showed him that survival was only the beginning. A person could endure pain for years and still forget what it felt like to truly belong somewhere. Sarah Collins continued visiting the cabin whenever she had time away from Pine Valley Animal Rescue. She remained the same compassionate woman Ethan had met during the rescue, with chestnut hair, warm brown eyes, and a gentle personality shaped by years of caring for abandoned animals. But Ethan noticed that Sarah had changed too. She no longer looked at the shelter only as a place where animals waited for homes. She began seeing it as a place where broken lives could begin again. The experience with Bear and Finn had reminded her why she started rescue work in the first place. One afternoon, Sarah arrived carrying a folder filled with documents and photographs from Pine Valley Animal Rescue. She sat at Ethan's kitchen table, while Bear rested near her feet and Finn watched from beside the fireplace. "I wanted to show you something," she said. Ethan looked through the papers and saw pictures from the shelter's adoption events. Many animals had found homes, but one image caught his attention. It showed Bear and Finn sleeping beside each other on the day they first arrived. "They changed people's minds," Sarah said. "Not just yours. Everyone at the shelter." Ethan looked at her. "Even Mark?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Especially Mark." Mark Reynolds had not become a completely different person overnight. He was still organized, still practical, and still believed shelters needed structure to survive. But after watching Bear and Finn, something inside him shifted. He began changing the way Pine Valley Animal Rescue evaluated bonded animals. Instead of automatically separating pairs because they were more difficult to adopt, he created a new process that considered emotional connections before making decisions. The change was not because someone forced him. It was because he finally understood. For years, Mark had believed that making hard choices meant ignoring emotions. But Bear and Finn showed him that compassion and responsibility did not have to be enemies. Sometimes the most practical decision was also the most humane one. The shelter began receiving stories from families who adopted bonded animals that might have been separated in the past. Every success reminded Mark of 2 puppies from a snowstorm who had quietly changed the way he saw his work. Meanwhile, Ethan continued investigating the mystery behind the old canine tag connected to Daniel Hayes. He never forgot the discovery, and he never stopped wondering why Bear's collar carried the name of the man who had once been his closest friend. But the investigation moved slowly. Some military records remained sealed, and many questions had no immediate answers. Ethan learned to accept that not every mystery could be solved quickly. For the first time in years, he was able to wait. That was something he had never been good at before. During his military career, waiting usually meant preparing for danger. But now, waiting meant sitting on the porch while Bear and Finn rested beside him, watching the sunset over the mountains. It meant enjoying quiet moments instead of fearing them. It meant understanding that peace was not something he needed to earn. One evening, Ethan sat outside with both dogs lying beside him. Snow covered the distant peaks, and the air carried the familiar cold smell of winter. Bear rested his head against Ethan's leg, while Finn slept nearby. Ethan looked at them and thought about how different his life had become. He had spent years believing he lost everything important when he left the military. He was wrong. He had lost a chapter of his life, but he had not lost his purpose. Bear and Finn reminded him that protecting others was never only about combat or missions. Sometimes protection meant giving a frightened animal a safe place to sleep. Sometimes it meant opening a door that had been closed for years. Sometimes it meant allowing someone else to help heal the wounds you thought you had to carry alone. Months later, Ethan officially adopted Bear and Finn. The paperwork was simple. The meaning behind it was not. They were no longer rescue puppies. They were family. The cabin became the center of a new mission. Ethan began helping retired military canines and veterans who struggled after leaving service. He created a small support program where people and animals could heal together. He called it the second mission because he believed every life had another purpose waiting after the first one ended. When people asked him why he cared so much about 2 dogs he found during a snowstorm, Ethan always gave the same answer: because they reminded him of something he had forgotten. Nobody was meant to face every storm alone. Years earlier, Ethan thought the greatest losses of his life had taken away his chance to find happiness again. But standing outside his cabin with Bear and Finn beside him, he finally understood that some endings were only preparing the way for something new. The storm that brought 2 abandoned puppies into his life had also brought back a part of himself he thought was gone forever. And in the middle of the coldest mountains, surrounded by snow and silence, Ethan Walker finally found what he had been searching for all along: a home, a family, and a second chance. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or a sign from the sky. Sometimes, God sends them quietly through a small act of kindness, a lost soul that needs saving, or a broken heart that needs healing. Ethan thought he was rescuing 2 abandoned puppies from a snowstorm, but in the end, God used those 2 little lives to rescue him from the loneliness and pain he had carried for years. Bear and Finn remind us that every person, no matter how strong they appear, needs love, connection, and someone who will not walk away when life becomes difficult. In our everyday lives, we may not always recognize the miracles God places in front of us. They may come through a person we meet, a kindness we receive, or a responsibility we choose to accept. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, because your story and your prayers may inspire someone else. Subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories of courage, faith, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort those who are struggling, and guide everyone watching this story toward hope, healing, and a brighter tomorrow.